de novo, agradecendo a PUC pelo programa de internacionalização, que nos possibilita trazer os vários convidados. Semana passada nós tivemos Michael Cole, já tivemos a Caterina, já tivemos a professora Edna, e hoje nós temos o Andy Blunden, que vai conversar com a gente um pouco sobre chat, sobre as bases filosóficas e outras questões relacionadas, no meu ponto de vista, sobre mais os princípios da chat. So I'll start in English, okay? If you have any questions, just send them on chat. We are going to do so that Andy is going to present for about 16 minutes, and then we go to questions. There are some questions from the audience that people sent previously, and feel free to send your questions in the chat and also on Facebook at Brincadas, okay? We are also live on Facebook on the page of Brincadas. So Andy Blunden is an independent scholar in Melbourne, Australia. So Andy is already living the future. It's already Friday. Andy can see the future. It's already Friday for him. So he's in Melbourne, Australia, and he has published a number of books on chat, a number of articles also on chat and social philosophy. And Andy has given a great contribution to the Marxist archive, to the Marxist, that site, Marxists.org. So Andy is also behind that. Andy is a secretary of the Marxist Internet Archive, where also there is a big amount of different kinds of works related to Vygotsky, Leontiev, Marx, Hegel, lots of other philosophers, right? And in the last message we exchanged, Andy just pointed out that he's a social philosopher. So he's not a social psychology, nor a school teacher. So I think that shows a little bit where he comes from and from which stance he's talking to us. So Andy, thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for accepting my invitation with Fernanda for joining our group. Our group is comprised of many teachers, and just to pinpoint that the name of our group is Language and Activities in Educational Context. So we have a lot to do with language discussions, language analysis, linguistic analysis in our researches, and most of us are working with and in education. Okay, so welcome, Andy, and the floor is yours. The floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Monica. It's a great honor to speak to your group. Let me say at the outset that I agree with what Mike Cole said last week, that we are living in a singularity in world history. The American century is over, but what happens now is indeterminate. It's up to us. The subject of my talk is more analytical, though, and a very general one: how to understand complex processes. By complex process, I mean the social and political situation of an entire country like Brazil, or I might mean the current state of a science such as cultural psychology, or I might mean a single person, like a friend or a patient. So this is a very general topic. I take it that we have a practical interest. That is to say, we're not really interested in the whole history of the thing, the history of Brazil, what the Portuguese did and who did what to whom, but how things stand right now. Now, I'm just going to stop at the moment because I realized I need to start my PowerPoint presentation for you. Just 1 second. Share screen, and here we go. Share, and then I can do this. There. Okay. We know how things stand right now as we see them before our very eyes, and this is what we want to change. but we will have to look into the history of the thing to understand it, how things are at the understand how things are at the present. Our interest in the past is for a purpose, to shed light on the present moment, not to gain some perfect knowledge of an infinitely long and complex past history. Also, we want to understand the thing as a whole. That is the whole country, not just this leader or this pandemic or just the political system in isolation from the economic system, for example. So, what does it mean to understand something as a whole? Very easily said, isn't it? But how can we? How does this mean understanding every little last fact and detail, what the population is or the price of eggs? No, grasping something as a whole means forming a concept of it as a whole. The German language tells us this. Begriffen means to grasp, right? And the word for concept is der Begriff. To grasp the present moment is to form a concept of it, which is different to trying to explain every little detail. We want to get a handle on it, to grasp it as a whole, and that means forming a concept of it. How do we do that? The great German poet and naturalist Goethe, the philosopher Hegel, the communist Karl Marx, the Soviet psychologist Lev Vygotsky, all agree on the answer to this question. We have to discover that concrete, simple something which typifies the whole process, in which we can see in the present crisis. The relation on which the present moment rests is this concrete, simple something is the relation on which the present moment rests and is the key to practically grasping the thing as a whole and changing it. Marx, for example, grasped bourgeois society as the commodity relation, selling in order to buy, and capital as buying in order to sell at a profit. Out of that insight, he wrote Das Kapital, a work which is still studied today, 160 years later. Just like the biologist sees the cell as the basic unit of every organism, and politics is just making collective decisions.
Andy, excuse me.
I don't know what those little red marks are on the thing. That's something very strange that's happened. Anyway, the point is then, how do we find this concrete, simple something, and what is its nature? At this point, let me bring in another aphorism that sounds profound but can be misleading. It is said that everything is a process, or everything must be understood as a process. But this is not quite right. Sure, everything is in a constant state of change. But how do we understand the process, its motor force? For instance, wages may be falling, but how do we know that the next minute wages might suddenly start rising? We have to know the contradiction which is at the root of the process. We can't simply project something forward. We have to know what is driving the change. And this means understanding the thing, that concrete, simple something, as a contradiction. And that's what the concrete means, in fact. When we say concrete, simple something, the concrete means a unity of two distinct determinations. So that is why Marx took a commodity as a unity of exchange value, the labor time needed to produce it, and use value, its usefulness, two different standards of value, each with their own roots. Just like Vygotsky took thinking as a unity of speech and intellect, each of which had independent roots in the child's development before intelligent speech arises as a unity of sound and meaning. If you understand the contradiction, the conflict underlying a process, then you can see why the process is going like it is and how it might change. So when we say concrete, simple something, the concrete means a contradiction, and the something is some relation or action. It's an unsolved problem of some kind, like a political party which needs to get elected, but its policies are unpopular with the electorate. What's it going to do? or a worker who discovers that their skill has been taken over by some new technique and they can no longer earn a living in their trade. Those are examples of contradictions that drive change and development. When we look at the present moment, a nation in crisis or a person suffering anxiety, a science which seems to have lost its way, we can see it. We feel it in our gut. It is right there before us. We are part of it. Unlike the past, which we only know by the records and traces left by the past, which we have to somehow piece together. But the present moment is so complex. It has a million different sides to it. That's exactly why grasping a complex process is a problem in the first place. You look at the situation in Brazil and 1,000 different problems and potential solutions and manifestations of crisis strike the eye. Everyone argues about what to do, what is the reason for things, which section of society is to blame, and which can solve the problem. There's just too much information. Here's where we need to look to the past. You make a first guess. Maybe the problem is a charismatic leader who deceives the people. Maybe the problem is endemic corruption of officialdom. Maybe it's habits originating in the colonial settlement of Brazil. I don't know. And let me be clear about that. I don't know. Maybe you don't know either. But you can form a concept of that concrete, simple something which you think encapsulates the present crisis. At this point, we have to turn to history. We see a country in crisis before us, and there are certain obvious features, symptoms of disease. But to diagnose the problem, you have to inquire into the past to learn where the problem comes from. And of course, you know that whatever the historical record tells you, it is not an objective image of past reality, but is itself an expression produced by that past. What takes place now is a back and forth movement. You look back to find when the germ cell you have in mind first appeared. You are particularly interested in the conditions under which the cell first arose. So you notice I'm using the word cell for my concrete simple something. It's also called a unit of analysis. Every writer has a different word for it, right? I'm using concrete simple something. Okay, you look at the conditions under which the cell first arose. You're interested to see what it was in that environment which makes sense of the formation of this first concrete simple something. What problem was it solving? You then start the reverse movement, coming forward from the past to the present, watching how the cell develops in response to and together with the conditions. And you are specifically looking for a cell which reproduces itself by reproducing the conditions which gave rise to it in the first place. The chances are that your first guess won't turn out to be correct. Let me give a couple of examples. Marx saw in his youth poor landless peasants who were being mistreated by the landed aristocracy. Now, the British had the most highly developed form of modern industry. So Marx looked back through British history and he found in the enclosures of the 17th and 18th century the roots of capitalism. Peasants were driven off the land to leave room for sheep, which were now more profitable than farmers. This created an atomized mass of impoverished vagabonds alongside a wealthy farming elite. But this was not a self-sustaining process. You can only rob people once, right? Robbery could not explain the ongoing expansion of capital, nor could the invention of new machinery. If this were the case, capitalism would have arisen centuries ago in China, where technology was more advanced. Marx found in this mass of laborers with no access to their own means of production, gathered together in towns and desperate for work, became a proletariat. And anyone who had the capital to purchase land and materials enough for one cycle of production could hire these workers and keep them on the poverty line so that they could never get enough money to own their own means of production. And in this way, capital could reproduce itself and reproduce the massive impoverished proletarians it needed to exploit. This relation, cheap labour power, bought and sold in the market as a commodity, was the key, the germ cell which grew into modern capitalism. Once this was in place, machinery could be used to increase the productivity of labour. I'll give you another example. Workers in Iran currently suffer under a theocratic regime which uses terror to suppress all opposition. Now you might, at a first guess, you might think that the origin of this regime was in the 1979 Islamic Revolution, which overthrew the Shah. But this turns out to be a mistake, because that revolution was led by the young intelligentsia and was supported by almost the entire nation, the organized workers, the urban poor, and the peasantry. The mullahs were just figureheads, really, ensuring the support of the poor who were otherwise sympathetic to the Shah. A closer look shows that the revolution was followed shortly afterwards by working class uprisings which seized control of the factories and enterprises and placed them under the control of shuras. That's a Shia Muslim form of commune. But the cultural level of the workers was not sufficient to run the economy, and the government needed to bring the factory workers back to run the basic units of the economy. But they had to be protected from the workers. So the mullahs, who managed to seize central government control by defeating the young intelligentsia who had led the revolution, used religious doctrine to raise a militia from amongst the poor and protect the bosses from their workers, but ultimately robbing the bourgeoisie of their wealth. Thus, the regime balanced between a wealthy but weak bourgeoisie and a fragmented working class, resting on militias raised from the expatriate and rural poor, secured by their religion. When the poor at last broke from the hold of the mullahs in 2019, the true relation of forces came to the surface. The shura, terrorized into submission to a powerless bourgeoisie by militias raised from the poor and disciplined by religion. This was the germ cell of the whole development of the Islamic State since 1981, when the shuras were formed. On this basis, the outbreaks of struggle in 2019 could be made sense of. Let me repeat then. We search back and forth in history to discover in clearest outline the concrete simple something which grasps the present situation in a nutshell, so to speak, which throws the present relations in the proper light so that we can understand the dynamics of this. The concrete simple something, the germ cell, always rests on a contradiction. It's a temporary solution to some problem which we find in conditions which arose in the past, but a solution which reproduces itself and its conditions so that it becomes a relatively permanent contradiction. It's a back and forth movement between the present and the past, between the part and the whole, between each episode of the story and the overall plot. Each makes sense only in the light of the other, so we go back and forth. It's a hermeneutic circle. Once you've grasped the situation as a whole, you can fill out the details. Once you see the place of the present moment in the whole unfolding crisis and the conditions which sustain it, then you can figure out what to do next. This is how the ideas brought to us by Vygotsky help us understand our social and political situation practically. Thank you.
Andy, sorry for interrupting. Two things. First, there is this those red lines on your presentation. Maybe if you stop and start over, we would like to try that. And second, we are changing the person who is in charge of the subtitles. I think now it's going to be Larissa, right?
Right. You want me to? I don't think those red lines, I don't know what causes them, but they don't prevent you.
Maybe if we stop and start over, it disappears. Let's try that.
You want me to actually log off and come back in?
Okay, maybe, maybe it's too much if you just stop sharing and start again.
Okay, we'll try that. Let's stop
Let's
share.
try it.
Let's try it. Now, they're not on the ordinary page, so now I'll try share screen again.
Let's see what
Mônica,
happens.
me
Yes.
coloca já me coloca para...
Lu, você coloca a Lari como...
É a Vivi. Vivi.
I did.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
Vivi, and please, bloqueia a tela também para anotar. Obrigada.
É a Vivi Carijo, só. Funcionou.
My share screen's not working properly. I don't look. Let's let the share screen go. It doesn't matter. Okay.
I have your talk here. I can share it.
Okay.
If you
Just a
want
minute, please.
to...
I'll tell you what I can do. I'm just going to share that one slide. I think I can do that. Hang on. Oh, okay. Yeah. Thank you. But go to the last slide, because the last slide is a summary. There we go. That's good. So people can have a read of that. Now, we have some time for discussion, I hope. I'm not hearing anything back.
Yeah, we do have time for discussion. So let's do so that I need to, let me check. I have the questions people sent us. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Put the questions up, much better.
Yeah, give me just a minute, right?
Yep.
So here are the questions. So the first one, I think it was by Larissa, right? Larissa. Would you like, Larissa is in the...
Yes, I can,
yes,
sorry.
Yes. Yeah, she's in the subtitle. I'm going to read them. So I found your text very interesting and a great reminder of the challenges for identifying the germ cell or unit of analysis. Could you talk more, maybe provide other examples of the hurdles of identifying them from what is it, as it's not obvious how they are determined? Could you identify contradictions to be conducive to determining the unit of analysis?
Okay, a very good question. Now, first thing is, it's not as if there's just one answer to the question of what is the unit of analysis, right? Each unit of analysis gives a particular view on the whole. Different writers will find a different unit of analysis in the object, and they will explain the whole thing differently. So there's not just like one scientific answer, that's it, this is the whole thing. All the different writers that write about psychology have a different conception of the unit of analysis they're dealing with. And consequently, they write different theories. And in politics, you find different people have different opinions, right? This is not something that can be done away with. It's like an art rather than a science. Let me give an example. There's the example I gave in the longer paper that I submitted some time ago. Foucault, the famous French philosopher and writer Michel Foucault, he thought that the society he lived in was like living in a prison where you were being watched all the time. Yeah, I can see that. So he looked back in history and found in the late 18th century, I think, when the nations first built prisons and large conscripted armies, and particularly prisons where you had all the cells situated so the guards could watch you all the time. He thought this is this is present day society in a nutshell. Okay, it's, of course, we don't all live in prison, but the modern world is like a great big prison. Now that's his view. It's the way some people view the world, right? But I would say that we have a dog.
He has something to say. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Andrea, we need you to... Andrea, a gente precisa que você desligue seu áudio, Andrea. Andrea Fonseca. Andrea.
Can you...
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Sorry. And
okay. That's a particular view. I mentioned the example of Iran. A lot of people would say, well, it's an Islamic Republic, and that was established in 1979, end of question. But that's an outsider view that is not familiar with what Islamic Republic meant to people in 1979. In 1979, a young progressive people in Iran said, look, we don't want Moscow, we don't want Washington, we want a particularly Iranian, an Islamic type of state, right? We want to, go our road, not join up with the West or the East. And a lot of people would think the same. Maybe Lula says, we want a Brazilian form of socialism. And all they were saying in 1979 is they wanted to build a form of socialism that was specifically like their culture, right? But it changed. It was like an internal coup. The progressive young people who had led the revolution were actually overthrown, but the outside world is not aware of this. They're hypnotized by the sight of all these mullahs, right? And the cameras go there. They don't see that the original government that was installed by the 1979 revolution was not made up of mullahs, but of young progressive people, who were, they were overthrown. There's no surefire way. It depends on an analysis of the present situation, which shows itself to be deep. If you follow it through and understand it, you get a good insight into the whole process. Now, I would say Foucault's idea, it's an idea about the present reality. We're all being watched all the time. We discipline each other. But it doesn't really capture the nature of the situation we're in. It just shows one aspect. Likewise, to say that the Islamic Republic, the nature of the republic is simply Islamic Republic, only captures one aspect of Iran. It doesn't capture the peculiar nature of the system of terror which is used to keep the working class in submission, right? So it's always an art, but you have to find a contradiction because of two things. If it's just, you see, just one thing, like value depends, is a measure of how useful something is. You think, oh, that's very good. That explains the value of something. But it doesn't, you see, because how can you say that a diamond is more useful than a bicycle? You buy a second-hand bicycle for, $50 or something, and a diamond will cost you $10,000. It doesn't make sense to say it's more useful. Oh, Marx said it depends on the labor required to produce it, but that doesn't work either, because if you work out a way of making something, You know, something may be very difficult to make, right? But if there's no use for it, people will just not make it. Yeah. And labor, for instance, craft work. People make things in their home. I don't know if it happens in Brazil, but it happens in Australia. People spend hours and hours and hours making, you know, knitting things and so on, which are very beautiful, but they can only sell them for a certain amount. They don't get anything like the value of the labor put into them, right? So you have to see that value is determined by two different opposed things, and the contradiction between them moves capital around the whole economy, you know. And if there's a need for something, then capital moves into that section of the economy and introduces new techniques, you know, and drives down the price, you know. So the value turned out to be like a motor for the changing structure of the whole economy. Yeah? Does that answer your question, I hope? Maybe we try another question.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Larissa? Yeah.
I don't know if Larissa would like to comment on this. But based on
Good.
what...
I don't know why, Chris. I was wondering you were going to jump in.
I'm sorry.
Well, please.
It's just that I read the piece that you wrote, and I was already puzzled with that. And now with your explanation, it became even more struggling to me. The thought that what we think of, we might consider it something. We look back in the past, and we look at something, and I was trying to make connections with our reality here in Brazil. And then if I want to make sense of what we are living right now, which is absolutely hectic, one might look back and think that what created the conditions for us to be living what we're living right now would be the coup, or the overthrow of President Dilma a few years ago. And I am calling it a coup, but a lot of people call it an impeachment, saying that she was rightfully taken off power for what she had done. So what I am saying is that this is always ideological, because it depends on how people would look at this specific event in the past. And then, and maybe that in itself may think that this would be a great unit of analysis, as contradiction is definitely in there, right? There's definitely contradiction in there. On the other hand, my first thought is, how does that, if we think of this event in such different ways, how can this explain what we're living right now? This is one thing. And the other thing that it keeps in my mind is that if we see history as a continuum, then everything happened because of something else. And then why choose this specific moment to say that this represents the complexity of what we're living right now? Don't know if
May I jump in when Chris finishes? Okay.
I'm done.
So yeah, that was my question, and I think it complements what Chris is stating. When we go through Vygotsky, I think it's collected works number 4. Sylvia Scribner, she also brings that about this historicity as a movement. And I think Vygotsky says that naive are the psychologists who says that history has to do only with the past and the present, but it has also to do with the future. And if we go through more or the new other scholars that study chat, like Engstrom and Stetsenko, they talk about agency. I know it's a different topic, it's a different issue, but I'd like to bring that because I think it has to do with what Chris posed and what you are discussing. The idea of envisioning the future Engstrom talks about agency as a possibility of envisioning the future. And Stetsenko, she also talks about this transformative agency and this activist positioning as a way to I don't know if it's intervene, but to impact or to move something in the future. So if we are analyzing contradictions from the past and how they impact in the present, how would we consider the future then? How would we envision a unity of analysis in the future? And this is something we Brazilians have been discussing a lot, and we always make jokes out of some things, and this is one of the things we shouldn't, but we make joke out of it, on how we would tell how will history teachers teach history 20 years from now? How would history teachers just explain the whole year going past 5 years regarding the coup or everything we've been through? So this current situation of COVID and with the amount
Monica,
of deaths and the whole situation. Yes, just to complement.
I have too many questions, right? I've just made a list of about 5 questions I have to answer, so I need to catch up. Okay. Now, firstly, it was Chris, I think I was speaking to before, wasn't it? Yeah, look, yes, it's ideological. No question about it. There's no escape from this. We speak as progressive people that want to see progressive change, and other people don't see it that way. They speak from a certain social position. Maybe they have some privileges in the current arrangement and they want to hang on to them, and we won't convince them. But if we are right in our position, if we have some justice, if it's not just us as individuals have some peculiar view, if we represent a social position which is that of the vast majority of ordinary people, then there's value in what we say. Yeah, maybe we're ideological too, but if the social position represented by what we say is that of the vast majority of people, then we can break through. Okay, we can win. There's a basis for what we say. There's more of a basis for what we say than someone whose position is that of a minority of people. Even though they may triumph today, ultimately we have a sounder basis in reality than someone who speaks from a very narrow point of view. Now, about continuity, you make a very powerful point, Chris. If we go back to history, we can go back and back and back and back and back. In actual fact, the point you choose to stop at, that's the ideological point. Foucault, when he looked back in history, but he already had an idea about the nature of the present world. It was like a great big prison where we're all being watched by everyone else and disciplined by everybody else. So he looked back and found the origin of that, right? But like other people will say, oh, capitalism has always been here. Look, you find it in Rome, right? And they'll go back and find that, in a hunter-gatherer community, that they had, they had goods, therefore that was capital, right? The point is, this is not a simple question, right? The first thing is, history is not just continuous. History, like the process of development of an individual, goes through certain stages, and how a given stage unfolds depends a great deal on that catastrophic moment, that leap, that crisis from which it begins. So we know from Vygotsky that the child development, the development from the womb to young adulthood, is made up of a series of periods marked by distinct crises, right? And the child development is not the same as social development, because children grow up into an existing society, right? Whereas the world grows its own way. It has no model that it has to fit into, but it shares this feature that there's to be a certain contradiction, right? For example, the commodity relation, where people's needs are being fulfilled by exchange, and that's got a certain logic to it. And hundreds of years of history can unfold according to that contradiction. And attempts to break from that prematurely just lead to horrible distortions, right? But at a certain point, like I laugh sometimes when you see these Star Wars movies that are looking hundreds of years into the future, and still they have different companies that are owning the spaceships. They cannot see. They can see flying through time and to the other side of the universe, but they can't imagine a world that isn't governed by private property. But the fact is that the idea that the principal means of communication, that is to say the internet, with its email and Zoom and all this, these are a private property of a handful of individuals. I mean, this is absurd. It's a terrible contradiction. And at some stage, we'll go beyond that, right? So the history isn't continuous. You go back to the origins of relations, which are particularly characteristic of the present moment. And that when you've got a really crucial contradiction, like for instance, the sale of labor power, people working whose labor is something on the market, bought and sold, like potatoes, right? That's got an origin. If you go back 1,000 years, life wasn't like that. People worked in a way according to their family and social position, according to their duty, if you like, in the community. It wasn't bought and sold. Now, just to talk about the future, I claim, and Mike Cole said so last week, that we live at the moment in a discontinuity. There's this term, the American century. I'm sorry to speak to Brazilians about the American century, but it means the United States of America century. It's from 1915, when America intervened in the First World War, up until somewhere about now, like when they elected an idiot for a president, right? That was a whole century and pretty close, exactly 100 years, where they determined what happened in the world, right? It was their century. That's over, right? They don't any longer control the world. Their principal adversary, the Russian Revolution, which happened about the same time as America entered the world stage and tipped the balance of the First World War. Same time, the revolution happened in Russia, but that's now gone, right? We don't have a Soviet bloc any longer. So the whole world system is just unstable. And then when you had this pandemic, where suddenly everyone's divided up into little bits. I mean, in Australia, we're in a complete quarantine wall. No people going in or out. We have no COVID, right? But we have no people traveling in and out either, And we even have borders on our internal states sometimes, right? So we're all divided up. And this is, it's one of those moments when I don't know, the future is indeterminate, Monica. We don't know, but we will find out. We will make that history. It's not determined in advance. Now, it's like, how will history be told in the future? Well, when you write your autobiography, you're 80 years old, you think it's time I wrote my autobiography. You look back on your life and you remember certain experiences, things that happened to you and how you handled them. And it's how you handle those crises. That's what makes you. You make your own life, not by people come and give you gifts, but how you handle the problems that are given to you and how you overcome them, how you live through them. And in psychology, we call them переживания. This is the Russian word, yeah? And they're like experiences. I'm sorry for my signers, the word переживания. It's a Russian word. You have to do your best with that, yeah? And history, likewise, is made up of a series of these crises. And if you write the history, you say what happened in these different and how the world was changed. Once the ground has been changed, the rules are reset, then everything unfolds in a predictable and even way, working out the little problems, solving the difficulties that arise, and sorting things out until you get to a point where you can't go on any longer. The system comes into a crisis and a new chapter opens. All right. Now, I want to say there's something about the question of agency. I'm going to open the chat box for a minute, and I'll put here, this is sorry, where are we? Enter, URL. I don't like to use the word agency. Sometimes I use the word agency, you know, like a heading, you know, like a heading. But it's a bad concept because agency is something different when you're talking about a newborn infant, a neonate, a newborn, who first learns to distinguish between their own body and the outside world, or a person, you know, a young adult who's finding their way around in the playground, or an adult who joins a union, a trade union, in order to shape their life, right? Agency means different things, you see. So if I would ask you, what's the unit of analysis? What's the germ cell, the concrete, simple something which represents agency? Then either you're going to say, I don't know, I'm completely flummoxed, you know, I just don't know how to answer that question. Or you're going to give me a very specific answer to tell me you're just talking about some specific phase of life, right? Usually people have in mind like a young person who feels not included, you know, and it's just a specific problem of an interpersonal problem, right? But that's not agency. The agency we have to deal with is how millions of people can come together and solve this crisis with the destruction of the conditions for life on Earth. Yeah, the imposition of dictatorial and crazy governments on us. This is the problem of agency, and that's a very different problem than say a young person who can't now make friends and get control of their own life, maybe homeless, needs to find a job, right? Different to a toddler, you know, like a small child who needs to satisfy their own needs. So the problem with the concept of agency is that it doesn't have a unit of analysis, which means it's not a concrete concept. It's just a general category. It means people talking about agency and writing scientific papers about agency are just moving abstractions around. They haven't figured out what it is they're talking about. Yeah, either that or they've found a Latin word for agency. I don't know, that may be Greek. They've found a nice scientific sounding word for a problem which is far more specific. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Andy.
Oh, I'm sorry. I see I've sent this URL only to one person by mistake, someone I was discussing with some time ago. I now give the URL to everybody. Okay, that's answered all those questions. Monica.
There are two more questions.
Yes.
Larissa, would you like to read them? Now you're not.
Thank you, Mo. I think there are other two questions on the chat.
Yeah, there are two questions on the
well.
chat. Okay, so let's go for them. Valeska, would you like to speak up? Valeska and Paul, but Valeska is the first one. Would you like to speak up? Okay, so I'm gonna read it. It's a comment actually. And Valeska, if you want to just jump in, right? So Valeska, she said, Valeska Brites, the situation in Iran was not that different from what's going on right now in Brazil. She said that when you're back talking about Iran, and proportionally speaking, of course.
Yes, I think there's a type of state form called, sometimes called Bonapartism, sometimes called Caesarism. It's where you have a situation in a society where there are opposed forces, but neither one is strong enough to overcome the other, right? So you have a stalemate. And Argentina under Perón is the textbook example of this, where there's a stalemate between two forces. So an individual, a powerful, charismatic individual, comes forward to take control of the situation, but the only power he has is by balancing between these two opposed forces. But every type of Bonapartism has its specific character, and I think it's likely that someone that knows about Brazil, which is not me, right, can investigate and discover the peculiar nature of Bonapartism in Brazil that produces sometimes very good progressive Bonapartes and other times very reactionary and stupid Bonapartes. But somehow or other, but that's just a guess, I don't know. It really needs a concrete analysis.
Then we have Paul Pryor. Is it the right way to pronounce his surname, Pryor?
Yes, that's exactly it. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Paul. So can you make your question?
Yes. So Andy, the question I had was about the concept of contradictions. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how you see the relationship between the idea of finding the contradiction in a germ cell or in a concrete, simple thing, and Engström's approach, where you find multiple contradictions within and across kind of more situated activity systems.
Yeah, look, the two ideas come from the same stable. They're not contradictory, but if you have a difficulty in an organization, you may have someone, the signs of that difficulty may be a big argument, do this or do that, or there may be, as pointed out to me, someone just goes sick and goes home and doesn't come back. But this alerts you to there being some problem, right? And in an organization, there can be multiple problems. And Engström has developed a particular sort of method and you know, like primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary contradictions. It's a whole, you know, method approach of analyzing organizations. I'm really just I'm focusing on this identification of the contradiction for really what I have in mind is much more complex organizations, that is to say, like a whole country or an entire science. But it could be a particular organization. We're talking about the same thing, right? I'm just bringing certain ideas. You know, the way I explain for instance, the term, why do I call it a concrete, simple something? Because I'm referring to a German term, das konkrete einfach, which the best translation I can give of that is a concrete, simple something. Einfach is an adjective, which means simple. When you put einfach, it means a simple something. So I'm referring to Hegel, because by referring to Hegel, I'm going back to the source. And so that way, I'm trying to take away from the fact that every different writer in our tradition, in chat, has a slightly different idea about what the unit of analysis means. So what I've tried to do is go right back to the beginning of this idea. And in Hegel's writing, you can find about, at least 30 different examples of this, what Vygotsky called a unit of analysis, what Marx called a germ cell, and what a lot of people talk about a contradiction. And so that way I try to get most clear about the nature of this thing, okay? But Yulo's talking about the same thing I'm talking about.
Okay, so let's go back to Larissa's questions. Maybe you can speak them up, Larissa.
Can you share? Because I don't have I don't have them open here.
Just a minute. I think I lost them. Sorry, just a minute. Yeah, here they are. Here. Can you see it?
No.
Not yet.
Oh, there we are. That's it. This is a second question. This is good.
Yeah, so my question was that I found the text very interesting. I want to thank you, and thank you for talking about the first question. I was typing in Portuguese, but I could understand. Thank you. So the idea that I wanted to ask is about the collective decision as a unit of analysis in politics. And if you could talk more about that. But you did share examples of other political situations. So maybe we can go to the next question, Monica.
Okay. Yes. I've written a book on collective decision making, which Larissa is aware of. And so it's good if you can read that book, but I know that's asking a lot. I wrote this book because of the state of the left in where I live. There were these two groups arguing with each other, and they had two opposite ideas about how to make collective decisions, and I couldn't understand why they just couldn't cooperate. Yeah, it seemed a mystery to me. So I then began to investigate, because they both had stories about the origin of their particular view of decision making. You had anarchists mostly that said, oh, the proper way to make a decision is you only if everyone agrees can you do it. And the socialists in the trade unions and so on, they say, no, majority decisions. That's the proper way to make a decision. And they just couldn't get on, right? And that was very distressing, because both groups were progressive groups that should be fighting together. And they were trying to work together, but they're always arguing. So I looked back into history, right? Now, when I began to think about it, I realized that making a collectively binding decision is the germ cell of politics. That's what politics is, right? Simply doing what you're told is not politics, right? That's a part of life, but that's not politics. If mum says be home by 12 o'clock, then there's no politics, there's no arguing back, right? You just got to do that. And if a policeman says, stop smoking in here, no smoking, there's no politics there. Okay, but when you make a decision, also, if you have a discussion and you say, oh, well, I think it's this and you think it's that, been a nice talk, see you next week. That's not politics either. That's just having a coffee house discussion, right? But if you say, look, we disagree about this, and if we don't disagree, it's irrelevant. Well, we disagree about this, but we have to do this together. So let's make a decision that's binding upon all of us. Right? Now, that's then politics, because we all live in Brazil, say. You've got to decide who's going to be the government. Now, you can't all have your own government. You're going to get one government. So how do you collectively decide, all 220 million of you, to decide to have one government? So that's politics, right? Now, what I found was it was very useful because I discovered that it was an ethical question. People often explain to me why this or that method of making a collective decision was a good one, because it was practical. The people that were for majority said, well, you know, you make a majority decision because if you wait for every last person to agree, you get nothing done. And then the consensus people say, well, you have to have a consensus because if you're going to ask people to go into a very dangerous situation and they haven't agreed about what to do, they're not going to be committed. They'll probably won't go. Now, both of these are pretty true things. It's a contradiction, right? Now, what I found is I looked through history and I found that before there was voting, you had collective decision-making, but it was a different type of collective decision-making called council, where you had, for instance, the king had to make a decision, but the king didn't make a decision on their own. They had their council, their advisors, and every one of the council was asked their opinion, and then the king listened to everybody, and once the king had listened to everybody, they made a decision, and then that decision was final. That was everybody's decision, right? And then you think about that, that's how businesses run. That's how families run. Mum and dad just, discuss it. They listen to the kids. Oh, okay, you don't want to go to the beach. Okay, you want to go to the beach. No, you know, whatever. Okay, we've listened to everyone's opinions. Here's what we're doing. We're going to the beach for a holiday. End of discussion, right? That's an important and legitimate type of decision making. Now, for example, if someone at work gets victimized by the boss and everyone else comes around, look, what are we going to do? Do you want us to fight back and get the boss to apologize, or we just let it go? Now, actually, it's that person who was insulted, perhaps. It's really down to them in a sense. It's their issue. And they might say, look, no, I think I'd just let it go. Or they might say, no, I'd really appreciate it. I want everyone to back me up here, right? And then you can decide whether you're going to. So there are actually three types of making decisions. Council, where there's one person, consults everybody, makes a decision. There's majority, and majority decision only arrived in English history in the 10th century when you had merchants traveling around the country outside of feudal relations who had no rights, and they could be hunted like animals, right? Because they were outside of their home territory. They had no rights. So they clubbed together for mutual support. And mainly if they died far away from home, that their mates, their friends, would collect them and bring them back for a funeral in their own home and look after their spouse and children, right? The main purpose. So it was in bourgeois development that majority decision-making arose. But it also, of course, was adopted by the working class. And it was only when you get to about the Second World War, the aftermath of the Second World War, as a result of the sacrifices workers made in the war and the part played by the Soviet Union, there was a kind of compromise, and of course, in most countries, working people did very well out of the Second World War after it was over, right? Got much better conditions. But there as a result was a lot of people felt excluded. The people in the colonial countries, for example, they were left out. Women say, hey, what about us? What about us? The African Americans said, hey, we want some rights too. And so there was a new ethos of inclusion. And people wanted inclusion. Inclusion meant that they had to be consulted on everything and that their decision had to count. And that was against majoritarianism. It was no longer sufficient to say, well, the majority want to do this. If there's a minority that's being overlooked. Now, what you find is this tension between these three types of decision making. It's an ethical difference that runs through politics. Now, I don't say this is going to explain everything. It was necessary for me to understand the crisis on the left, which is a continued crisis, the crisis between including every last person with the most peculiar and individual kind of particular needs and the interests of masses of people, and somehow or other including them all together. This is a real problem. You know, people, so this analysis of collective decision making, these three great sort of modes of collective decision, modes of politics, shed a certain light on things. It doesn't solve the problem, but it just tells me, say, look, here's a difference. Each of these things have a legitimate basis, but you know, you've got to work together and decide when it's appropriate to be inclusive and when the majority has to make the decision and when it's actually down to one person to tell us what to do. And then there's no formula for that. It requires judgment. I hope that answers the question, Larissa.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
And I think you have a last question, right?
Yeah, I have another question. I wrote many questions, but I was wondering if anyone else would
just
like
before
to ask.
just before we move on, Sandra Borges, can you explain on how she clicks to start doing the subtitles? Lari, could you explain it to her?
Você assinalou a transcrição
Já
para
tá
ela? Vai
liberado
aparecer
para
uma.
mim?
Vai aparecer
Vivi Carrijo.
Vai aparecer uma caixa na sua frente, Sandra. Aí você já escreve.
Então é que não apareceu.
Ainda.
Agora sim, agora foi. Tá bom. Beleza.
Thank you. So, do we have any more questions from the audience? Pessoal, mais perguntas para o Andy? Lari fez várias, mas seria bacana se tivesse alguém mais da audience. Pessoal do Facebook. Sure.
Yeah, Andy, hi. I wrote a message to you before, and I was wondering, when you describe units of analysis, is it possible to get smaller things? Like, for instance, I gave you an example of something I discussed with my students, like such as lobby in the industry or something like that. Is it possible to reduce the units of analysis to smaller things for students to realize the politics involved inside of those units?
Yes. I use as a unit of analysis for understanding social life, generally, a project. I just write this word in the message. I don't know what the Portuguese is for this word, but there are many different projects. A project might be socialism or Christianity. So this is a big project that lasts for hundreds of years, right? But a lobby is a project as well. So you have a group of people that share a social situation, that they're dissatisfied, like you might be disabled people that find that the people that are being sent to look after them aren't properly trained, or something. So they say, let's form a lobby group. Now, a lobby group is an example of a project, right? Now, the project, it has a life cycle. It begins with people in a certain social situation that are not necessarily aware that there are other people like themselves, but they're all in the situation and they're all complaining and trying to solve this situation. And then they look around and they see there are other people doing this as well, right? So they say, we have a problem here, lack of services or lack of education for disability. In fact, we think about this a bit more, it's disability rights, right? So they start with a very particular point of view, that their workers need more training, education, And then it becomes general because, oh, actually, we need more money. We need better accommodation. We need to be treated like people as well, not as disabled, right? So as it goes on, as the project goes on, it gets a more developed, more concrete view of itself. It starts off as a campaign to get education for disability workers and ends up disability rights. And they say, we're people with disability. We're not disabled people. You know, big, important thing, right? Doesn't define me, right? But by the way, I want some this and that and the other thing sorted out. I want you to change to include me, right? So that trajectory, that path is in common between all projects. So you have socialism begins with solving the particular problems of employees, getting better wages, safe conditions. And as it goes on, it realizes we can't just do this way. We need to actually be in government. We can't just fight every day for better wages and fighting against our employers. We need to have laws passed to make this happen. Therefore, we need to have a whole program for how the world should be run, right? And it's called socialism, right? And around about 120 years ago, you know, about the turn of the last century, masses of workers joined together with the little political groups and made socialism, right? So use this idea of a project to understand that there can be a lot of different types of project, and that's a unit analysis, right? So in Leontief, it's called activity, right? Engstrom calls it an activity system. In Vygotsky, you call it a concept, right? Because if you say socialism, that's a concept. But what does it mean? It actually refers to, it's a name given to a project, right? And every concept, actually, if you analyze it historically, it has historical origins. And when the people with disabilities eventually succeed and they don't any longer need to have a lobby group, that's because they're completely included. And everyone understands that disability is a two-sided question. It's a product of the general community, which has failed to provide for people that may be blind or may be deaf or something. And therefore, you don't any longer need a specific lobby group, right? So the concept of having a disability, right, is the outcome of a long project to get that concept established and made part of the language, so to speak, right? So that's a unit of analysis. Different writers have given different names to it. I use the word project because it's easy to understand the life cycle of a project. Like I explained, a group of people are all trying to do something and suddenly notice that other people are doing it, and then they join together and they run up a flag, you know, and say, rally around our flag. And then when they win, the social movement goes away, and they're just, but the world has changed, right? So it's a life cycle. The world has changed, new problems arise. And then a new generation will say, hey, something's wrong here. And they start a new one. So it's just like renewed. New people come along all the time and change the world. New projects are launched continuously out of one world in order to change the world into something different. Yeah, thank you, Renata.
Any other question or any other questions? So Lari, maybe you could make your last one.
Okay. My last question was, you mentioned in the end of your text that the dialectical reconstruction is not subjective, does not come from subjective reflection, but from the social practice itself, and is acquired by the theories by means of critical examination. Could you talk more about that? How exactly is it not subjective?
Yes, Larissa is referring to the longer document, which I sent maybe 6 or 7 weeks ago. And you'll find it on my webpage if you want to look at it again. See, when I wrote my first book about chat, and I looked at my experience of chat and all the different people who were saying different things. And it seemed to me that my analysis of that was that the concept of unit of analysis was the unit of analysis for the history of this science. That was the key concept which made it what it particularly was. What made chat different from other sciences was a self-conscious adoption of a unit of analysis. And I mean, other scientists don't do that. They may have a unit of analysis, but they don't make it so central. And when I looked at the way the science developed, that is to say, I read the books that people wrote, and I raised this question. Now, it wasn't, can I put it, where did I get the idea of unit of analysis from? Well, Michael Cole and Lev Vygotsky and Alexa Leontief and Yura Engstrom, they told me, because they wrote it in their books. So it didn't come out of my head. Maybe Hegel invented it, or Vygotsky invented the idea from their study of what they were doing. But my study was, at that time, was the crisis in cultural psychology and chat. And when I looked at this, the science itself told me, right? And people, when I raised this question, we said, oh, that was back in the 80s. We don't, who wants to talk about unit of analysis now? That's old stuff. Forget about it, right? But no, because I could see that the different groups having their sailing off in slightly different directions, all friends like a family, yeah, but they were diverging because of different interpretations, understanding of the unit of analysis. So that's why I went back to Vygotsky, and he only has one article about it, right? One chapter, a dozen pages. So I went back and I found it in Hegel, or I went, through Marx to Hegel, and I found, where did Hegel get it from? He got it from Goethe, right? And where did Goethe get it from? Got Herder. What's it? Herder. He's a German philosopher of that time, mid 18th century. But he didn't. Everyone developed it a bit more, right? Made it more precise. So then, I didn't make up what a unit is. It's not my idea. I got it from the writings of a tradition. I pieced it together from what these great writers themselves had said. Now, for instance, Marx, people say, oh, Marx's theory of labor does this and that. No, that's no such thing. Marx didn't have a theory of labor. The theory of labor was Adam Smith. What Marx did is he critically examined that because he found that's how capitalists think. What you find in Das Kapital is an analysis of how capitalists think, right? And sometimes when people are trying to understand the present moment, the destruction of the conditions for life on Earth, they think, oh, well, the theory of value is wrong. We should include nature in that. It's a misunderstanding, right? Marx wasn't someone that thought this and that should be value. He looked at how capitalists think, right? And they don't necessarily understand their own thinking, but he spent years and years studying the writings of political economists, you know, and it wasn't that he had to prove he was right and they were wrong. No, that wasn't it at all. He was trying to get a more concrete understanding of value and its implications by looking at it in history. So that's what I mean, is that the idea doesn't come out of your own head if it's a good idea. It's given to you in history. So when a particular leader says, you know, here's the government I'm going to create, here are the principles we stand from. Now, you don't just take them at their word, right? Because it's probably highly ideological, right? So you have to critically analyze what they're saying to find its real meaning. But the real meaning has to be found in that historical record, because the person, say, I'm giving, for example, someone who's founded a new state, and the way they explain why you have to have a new state and what the founding principles of this new state is an expression of their time and of the problem they're trying to solve. Therefore, it allows you to understand it. But to understand it through their own words, it's like a psychoanalyst that listens carefully to what the patient says. They don't sit back and say, oh, your problem is you're a schizophrenic or something. No, you listen to what the person says, and in their own way, they'll tell you what the problem is if you listen carefully. Now, history is the same. You can't, in some way, look back and tell history what the problem was. You have to listen to it, you know, and you have to listen critically. You don't accept it at its words, and you look at opposite voices, right? And you look at the conditions under which people were saying, and then you have to sum that up. Of course, there's a subjective personal element in it. This is true. But basically, what the individual person is trying to do is to accurately express what was objective. So there'll always be that personal element left over. But the idea is to express what history was saying, and to try and be a pure and true voice for history.
Thank you, Andy.
Okay, you're getting to the end, and before the final words, thank you. I'd like to invite everybody to open the cameras. Can you hear me?
Yeah, let me see everyone.
So we can take a picture.
Oh.
Yeah, the picture time.
If you want to open the cameras, if you don't want, it's fine. But we have this tradition of taking a picture with everyone.
Invitation.
It's the moment of inclusion, you see.
Yeah.
It's a part of the time we live in. Everyone needs to be included.
Yeah.
Who's taking the picture? Maybe Vivis could take the picture. Yeah. 1, 2, 3, and cheese.
I taking here.
Another one.
Thank you. Right. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So
okay. Now we can go back.
Right. The end is approaching. And well, we have 1 minute. There is a B here. I'm sorry. The end is approaching, and before your final words, and maybe if you could explain in your final words, how you see the future of activities of chat and your projects and ideas and developments. How do you think it can contribute even more to the future of chat? And what do you think it would be our mission here in the Global South?
Give us some words of hope and wisdom to deal with Brazil,
and how we can contribute to the future of chat, which is something we've been discussing.
I think there is hope for Brazil. We couldn't say that maybe 6 months ago, but clearly things are coming to a head in your country, and that may be some difficult times, but clearly it's come to an end. But what will happen next? Who knows? You know, really, who knows? But you can't solve these problems with a single individual. What you guys have produced in this community of, I mean, last week you had 75 people listening to Michael Cole. This is, you know, a powerful community of everyone thinking, you know, and discussing with each other. And you can solve this problem. You can play an important role. You know, look, I tell you, the future will be decided by adults, not by children. Don't delude yourself that by teaching the kids right, they'll all grow up and make a new world. You know, this is a relative truth. The decisions are made by adults, but you're adults as well. You know, and the way you teach the children, you show an example. You know, and you lead by example. And I think that your commitment to progressive values and to learning is a fine example to set. And your young people will always remember you when they grow into adults. But I think things will change in a much shorter time scale in Brazil before your children have to grow up. But maybe while they're young adults, they'll have some amazing experiences, I think. Future of chat, I don't know. It's also very indeterminate. It's indeterminate. On the one hand, it seems to be heading off in 50 different directions. And Brazil is perhaps exceptional in the size and the strength of your community. And maybe in the next generation, Brazil will be the center of chat, whereas America was previously and Russia was before that. Maybe the next generation will see Brazil as the center of chat. This is possible because it's so fragmented. Fragmented is good because it's creative. But at the same time, we need unity. You know, it's a contradiction. We want people thinking independently, you know, lots of invention and creation, but we need to bring all these different things together. And I tried to do so. My contribution is to teach the fundamentals. You know, I don't do so much research, but I try to bring us together with a common understanding of our roots, which our roots are hundreds of years old. We didn't just make up these concepts. Everyone has a different take, but in history, we find common roots. That's my contribution. And I'm very, very privileged to be invited to speak to you.
Thank you so much, Andy, for joining us. And thank you all for coming. Thank you, Larissa. Thank you, Vivis, for helping. Thank you, Dani. Thank you, Jose Carlos. Thank you, Sandra, that came last minute. Everton for the sign language. Daniela for the sign language. Once again, thank you, Pookie, for providing the space to us. And Andy, once again, thank you so much. Hope to see you again soon.
I hope so too.
And take good care of yourself. Take good care of yourselves, everybody. Bye. Tchau, tchau, gente. Boa Páscoa. Cuidem-se. Um abraço grandão para Fê. Vou mandar um abraço de super good vibes para Fernanda, para ela melhorar logo. I hope Fernanda gets better soon so she can be with us. Nosso próximo encontro é no dia 15 de abril. A gente não tem encontro na próxima semana. Our next meeting is going to be on April